Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined, as always, by my friend, co-host, and colleague, Darren King, ExoAcademian. Darren, we took a little bit of a break. It's great to be back together. I know you've been getting over a little bit of an illness, and I've just been slammed with work, but I've been looking forward to doing this show, getting back on the Liminal Frames horse. There's a lot to talk about, but before we get into that, how you been?
I've been good, indeed. It's been a strange few weeks. We talked about before we went on the air here just how it feels like the calm before the storm to some degree, like there's a bit of a lull. And yet, when you look at what's happening behind the scenes, there's a lot that's been going on. We'll get into that tonight, just in terms of revelations around just a sheer number of whistleblowers that have come forward and have spoken to Congress and whatnot. It is a bit of a strange time where what's going on above deck looks very different than what's going on below deck. So we can get into that for sure.
Yeah, that's exactly one direction I want to go. There have been a lot of things that have happened in the last couple of weeks. We had a really big article from Michael Schellenberger that I think turned a lot of attention and turned a lot of eyes to the topic. The Yes Theory documentary with David Grush, which was just released a few days ago, that got a lot of really positive attention. Of course, one thing we hadn't talked about, but the Netflix show has been getting a lot of attention as well. Encounters, the episodes there, that's been fantastic. Overall, really positively received. And then just very recently, a really interesting conversation between Danny Sheehan and Steve Bassett on basically the state of the legislation, the process, the machinations going on behind the scenes, where they think things are going. And these are two guys who are really plugged into what's happening on the Hill. So that was a really fantastic conversation to dig into. So I don't know, where do you want to start with all this? There's just so much happening. Like you said, under the surface, we're like looking at the top of the iceberg here. Under the surface, there's a lot happening. And we get hints of that from all of these different players that are telling us the audience gets bigger and bigger. The whistleblowers get larger and larger. The momentum is building. We're probably not going to be able to put this toothpaste back in the tube. It's inevitable. There's a lot of this inevitability to it, but wait and see as well. So how are you feeling about that? And what kind of momentum are you sensing right now?
Well, it is a strange thing to try to wrap your head around. And like you say, we're seeing these metaphors used over and over again: toothpaste back in the tube, genie back in the bottle. And yes, I think that part of the strangeness is that there's a time lapse between what's happening behind the scenes and what people are aware of sort of publicly, kind of thing. And of course, match that with the fact that still we're not seeing the legacy media take this up. Again, just to highlight this, as we have done over the last couple of shows, just to read the Schumer legislation from back to front, how that has not become mainstream news in itself is just shocking. Again, we come down to those things about either there's some sort of mass delusion spreading through government, a massive psyop of the largest order ever, and somehow it's working, or there's some monumental secret which changes our very understanding of 20th century history. You'd think any of those three would be worth a headline or two in legacy media, and yet we really don't see it. And in fact, as some people pointed out, in light of our last show, they're very quick and happy to talk about mummies from Mexico in the New York Times and whatnot, because again, that fits with their shtick about basically mocking the whole thing. They might not say it openly, but when you only cover cases that kind of fit with that X-Files kind of territory, then it kind of makes plain to people what your perspective really is. I think one thing to start with, and you talked about there in your list, was the Schellenberg article. That was really fascinating, and it had some tidbits in it that had not been publicly disclosed elsewhere, because he has some distinct sources beyond what other people have. And I have a couple of quotes here we can actually draw from and talking about here. This one was very interesting for a couple different reasons. Quote, testimony has included both first-hand and second-hand reports of crash retrieval and reverse engineering programs by U.S., Russian, and Chinese governments. The testing of materials obtained from retrieved craft, active and ongoing government disinformation operations, kinetic military action with UAPs, contact and collaboration with non-human intelligences, NHIs, and the successful reverse engineering of a triangle-shaped craft with unconventional propulsion, unquote. That one paragraph is a whole show in itself. Let's dive into that.
I mean, just mind explosion, one after the other. You can take any snippet from that one and just be like, whoa, wait, what? So it speaks to the point that you just made, that why is this story not getting more traction? Because these are some bombastic claims. And I get it. Look, I get it. People are frustrated that a lot of the sources are not publicly known. There's a lot of trust me, bro, happening right now. And it's easy to take shots at that. It really is. On the other hand, you've got a lot of people who have come public and who have excellent reputations, and they're saying these things. They're putting their weight behind these things. So if you're just kind of following an order of operations and just thinking logically through, it doesn't make sense to think that they're just blowing smoke up all of our butts. I just don't think that that's happening. So, but like sitting with it, like if you're really sitting with, and look, this happens to me all the time. I'll be driving the kids to school and I'm just like sitting with the reality of whatever this ocean animal is that I can't see, that I know is swimming below me, and it's there and it's real, and it's going to come up to the surface at some point. And it's going to surprise the hell out of me. Am I ready for that? Are we ready for that? And I think that in many ways our instinctual part of ourselves is kicking in. Like we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to face that kind of reality because it is pretty scary. It is, like you like to use the word, discombobulating. There's just so much to take in there. The biggest part of that quote for me is the collaboration, the word collaboration. And I think folks, if you're, it's one thing for all of us to be like, oh, we captured a downed craft, or, oh, we found some alien bodies, we're keeping them frozen somewhere. It's a whole other ballgame to say we're actually communicating with them and we are collaborating with them. That has tremendous implications.
It does. I mean, like you said, each of these is a bombastic claim all on its own that you would think would be national headline news. Thinking here about the acknowledgement here, there's been U.S., Russian, and Chinese governments involved in these kinds of things. That's fascinating in itself. We have, like you said, contact and collaboration. I'm going to put that aside for a second and come to the successful reverse engineering of a triangle-shaped craft with unconventional propulsion. What I love about this particular paragraph, and it's a great article together by Schellenberger, is how he doesn't just introduce the idea but leave it ambiguous. He's very clear about not only is it a triangle, but it's also using unconventional propulsion. So if you think it's just some sort of next generation Air Force vehicle, you're missing the boat. Like, this is the kind of vehicle that could only exist if it had been an example of reverse engineered technology. And I actually tweeted about this at the time where I read this, because this fits with some things that I'm aware of as well. I said, quote, speaking of the reverse engineering of triangle-shaped craft, I would suggest to you that more than one famous case of triangles being cited actually represented craft that were part of the U.S. arsenal, but interestingly, were not necessarily housed in the U.S., unquote. So what I was getting at there was that a couple of interesting things. Again, if you're a defense contractor and you are working on some of these programs, and eventually you might be singled out by Congress, there might be enough leaks that people come looking in your facilities. So one way you deal with that is you just move it overseas. By doing that, you escape the jurisdiction issue. I know that's been happening in a lot of different ways, not just in terms of the aerospace companies trying to escape that possibility, but also even some groups working towards disclosure involving some tricky situations with congressional oversight. They also are doing that from outside the U.S., but to impact the U.S. So this is very interesting. And when you really put these two together, the notion of historical cooperation and reverse engineering of craft, but then tie that in with famous cases of UFO sightings, what I'm suggesting here is that actually, I'm not prepared to say which ones, but there have been ones where my understanding is those were actually ours. They were reverse engineered successfully craft of technology that had its origin in non-human sources. So that really boggles the mind in itself as well, that some of these cases have been literally our craft. And this is part of the complexity. And again, people like Stephen Greer have spoken about this, right? And he has drawn this really strong distinction and said if it has rivets and those kinds of things, it's ours. And if it doesn't, if it's smooth completely, then it's theirs. I don't think it's quite that simple. I do think there probably are some distinctions, but that is also a very easy way to sort of any kind of event you think you want to associate with human beings, you can just say, well, that was likely a riveted craft, right? And every other one that was involving supposedly benevolent action, we can say that that was actually one of the ETs. And that brings me to the next tweet that I made in reference to this section, where I said, quote, skepticism is often invoked to resist elements of the data that someone dislikes more than others. If you're persuaded by some parts, but not others, based on similar evidentiary support, then this isn't really about skepticism, but personal preference, unquote. I think that's really key. Like when I survey the landscape and try to make sense of what people are saying about the UFO phenomenon, and some parts they're putting forward is very credible and other parts not so much, what I often see, and we all have to watch out for this, is just personal bias, unconscious bias even, where because this is not being subjected to scientific scrutiny the same way that other fields are, we can very easily fall into that tendency to only think that what we believe is what's really well supported. And we can say, I'm skeptical about this or that. And really, it's more about it doesn't fit with the preferred narrative we have. So getting back to what you said about Sheehan, I was actually really thankful to hear him say, while there are some people who want to, I think he used the word like have a Pollyanna kind of perspective on this is all positive ETs, we should go in not assuming anything. We shouldn't assume they're malevolent nor benevolent, and we should keep our eyes open. We should, I would add, just recognizing that humankind has so much diversity in terms of intent and maturity and levels of consciousness. We certainly should, at the very least, apply the same sort of scrutiny to what we may be interacting with here. As you and I have talked about, I think part of the confusion and the complexity involved in this all is that it's not like one of those options is going to be what's confirmed with disclosure or confirmation. It may be all of it. And how do people reckon with that when it's not just introducing one more element to a spectrum, but introducing an entire new spectrum to overlay on top of the one we already have that is complex enough?
Well, yeah, that's quite a lot to wrestle with all in one go. And I agree, it's incredibly challenging. And we all do it. We have to do it. We take shortcuts in a way as we're just digesting all the information. We're surrounded by information now. We take shortcuts and we simplify what we receive into little buckets. You know, I'm already okay with this. I'm not okay with that. And keep in mind, not only are we doing this, but the journalists do this as well. So when they're reporting on things, you can even see it in their reporting. Sometimes they're couching what they're saying in a way that you can tell they're uncomfortable with what they're saying. But like you said, it's coming from the same kinds of sources. So if you're looking at their chain of proof or evidence, it's a pretty solid chain. But on the one hand, you're like, I like what's saying. This makes sense over here. I can totally get on board with that. That seems solid. But over here, that's a bridge too far. I can't go there. And I think we're going to have to be a lot more flexible and be willing to bend with this, because the degree to which these truths are going to change us. I don't think we're really prepared for that. And we're going to get into this, I know, in this episode. How ready are we? I think a lot of the questions that we're going to go through tonight speak to that. How ready are we, in fact, for this kind of knowledge? And, you know, you and I, before the show, I used an analogy basically of, I liked this one, where you can get in a car and you can drive it really fast, and you can have a great, you can have a thrilling experience. I'm taking the car up to this on the highway, and I'm just, the wind in my hair, and I'm flying, right? It feels fantastic. But the faster you go, and and more importantly, into territory that you don't know, the more dangerous it becomes. And that thrilling ride can quickly come to a dangerous halt. And I worry a little bit that the folks who are pushing this forward have really kind of just had a thrill, and I think from the right reasons. Don't get me wrong. I think they're doing it all for the right reasons. But are they doing it with wisdom and with knowledge of where this journey is going? Because if they're not, it can be very dangerous for all of us. And I think we just have to be careful with that. And look, we all feed into this. I mean, our show feeds into this. I'm sure that, we're very pro this topic, and that gets folks fired up about where we're headed, and that creates momentum. You and I are big proponents of kind of this resonant field that gets created by energy, and we're adding to that. And I think we just want to be a little bit careful there, and prepare ourselves mentally for a slower pathway, or maybe even wanting a little bit of a slower pathway. And I'm sure some people will be shocked that I'm even saying that, but I think that we need to be careful.
Well said. And I think a couple of things come to mind. Number one, speaking of your fast car analogy, I was riding my Ninja 650 an hour before we got in the show, so I know what you mean.
Nice.
But on the other hand, too, I was thinking again about the complexity issue again, and overlaying not just one more piece of data into an already complex reality, which people have a hard time navigating often in modern life. In the midst of a society, at least American society, that seems rift with turmoil, to add to that this incredibly complex spectrum of data and interactions and beings and agendas, that gets very, very complex. So let's take, for instance, that one quote there that said contact and collaboration. So much, like you say, is implied in that. That means that, number one, we can contact and communicate with them, right? That it's not just like Close Encounters of the Third Kind and they wave at us and leave in their ship again, but actually that there's sit down, there's ongoing communication, there's accords that are arrived at, again, to think about David Grush kind of language here. And one of the things I've been pointing to that I think some people will find quite surprising, they hear accord and they think, okay, so when was that accord, singular, signed, and who was involved? And they assume it like somewhere at the top, like Eisenhower or something, as opposed to this notion that there may even be accords signed with different groups, with different services of the military, and that you're actually getting even some friction between, for instance, the Navy and the Air Force that are being cooperated with by different factions of NHI or NCHI, as I like to say. So think about that. Think about the complexity where one military service, like the Navy, is smoking out the Air Force, saying the Air Force and NORAD, as it says in this article, by the way, are not being honest with you. They're going to Jake Sullivan at the Biden White House and saying, you need to know something's going on here that they're not being honest about. And it's the very U.S. Navy telling on the U.S. Air Force. It's almost preposterous. Again, just that alone is something that you would think would be headline news. What's going on? If nothing else, even if the whole thing's a smokescreen, why is one U.S. military service trying to critique another one to the point where they're questioning their patriotism and their very purpose, right? To suggest such a thing, it's either true, which is a revelation of the highest kind, or it means something really dysfunctional is going on in our military services. There's so many elements to this that if the legacy media would just look at it and go, either option here is big story, what's going on? And, Michael Schellenberger has basically just done the job of a journalist. He's just developed sources that now trust him. He's confirmed the tidbits they've given to him with other sources. He's triple-checked things, that kind of thing. He's set a fairly high bar about who can be considered a credible witness. How do I corroborate those claims? We think about Watergate, right, and how that was done. And yet, all he's really done, and I think he would acknowledge this, is do the job of a journalist. You just do your homework and you walk it out and you see where the story takes you. How there haven't been more people in the mainstream legacy media wanting to do this, I don't know. And I think really at this point we have to ask, what is going on with the ownership of these papers? Why are they not, some of these billionaires, for instance, saying, listen, let's just take Jack or Josie and say, next 6 months, you just pursue this. Just see where it goes, just in case it's real, right? You would want to have the up and up understanding of what's really going on. You would think at least one journalist from your core would be worth assigning that to, and yet it's not happening, which of course prompts people to wonder, is the exact opposite actually going on here? That there's actually some coordination going on between the DoD and some of these legacy papers saying, we'll continue to give you the tips you need as long as you steer clear of this. It may not even be that specific in terms of what they've said, but there might be just this understanding. In this day and age, there's not as much money in media as there used to be in newspapers. So they rely on the DoD giving them tips for their stories, what's going on in Ukraine and those kind of things. And I think what we have to reckon with as a civilization is one of the fallouts of new media, which of course we're part of, and there's many great things about it. But the challenge is that there's just not the same gumption amongst the legacy media to do its job, and they don't necessarily have the resources to. So a lot of it's sort of defaulted to, listen, you give us a story, we'll just report on it. And there's not that speaking truth to power and even checking their sources. So this is a dangerous thing, even in terms of democracy.
Yeah, well said. And look, we're also dealing with the legacy of the stigma and how powerful that really is, because it comes into every conversation. Whenever this is brought up anywhere, that stigma is present, even amongst the diehards, even amongst those that really want to push this forward. So I think we have to be cognizant of that it's incredibly powerful. Like you said with the Schumer legislation, and as Dana Sheehan said as well, I mean, here's some detailed, very crafted legislation that was done in conjunction with the White House. So they're involved. And it specifically calls out some pretty amazing things. And Schumer himself on the floor of the Senate saying that it's one of his top 3 priorities. And yet we're getting nothing from our media on what's going on there. In fact, when it is discussed, the undertone of that conversation is essentially, well, we're finally going to shine some light on some black budget projects that the U.S. has had for decades, and we just haven't wanted to tell anybody about it. And we're going to come clean, and it'll be just our black projects. That's essentially what we're willing collectively, cognitively, to admit in that conversation. We're not willing to go that extra distance and say, well, crap, maybe these stories are real. Maybe these things actually happened. I think that's still a bridge too far in the collective mind.
You're right. And I think when we think about how this will gain traction in the mainstream, I think something that Steve Bassett said today, or was it yesterday, whenever that interview aired, was very interesting, because he spoke to the fact that this disclosure push is going to happen in 2 cities primarily. And he said Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles. And what he meant with Los Angeles was the media push. That he said basically because of his connections in Hollywood, he knows that almost every major production company has something in the works to do with the phenomenon. That's never happened in history, right? That's never happened in history. And you spoke about this new Netflix series. I think it's been like the #1 show. And this says a few things. Number one, it says people are interested in these stories. You're having really high production values given to these stories. They don't seem like, the kind of thing that you might have seen on Ancient Aliens or something where people find questionable. These seem like credible people. They are given a real sort of human story in terms of how they're described, and you see what the cost was for them for this experience, how it's changed them. Some really transformational kind of portrayals that were really, really compelling. And you find that not just was there the case with the Ariel School in Zimbabwe, but this case in this school in Wales, right? Very similar in some ways, some elements. And that one kid who was the one who was usually the skeptic, who was sitting or reading or something while everybody else was out playing, he heard them making a big hula about seeing a UFO. He's like, that's ridiculous. Goes out and sure enough sees this cigar-shaped object, right, behind the trees, which was great, by the way, that was cigar-shaped, because one of the things that Steve and Danny spoke about was how UFOs have become this iconic thing in American culture, where they're not just necessarily spacecraft, which they are that, but they're also so often associated with flying saucers. So a cigar-shaped object is a really interesting exception to the rule. And then one thing I found really interesting, I had actually not heard this story, I'm not sure if you had before, but the Fukushima incident, where basically the claim there was that during the meltdown at the Fukushima plant, which, by the way, at the time I was living in California, and I remember we actually had to be aware of radiation that was coming all across the ocean, right, to the California coastline, which just shows you how incredibly dangerous this kind of power is in this technology. But according to this claim and numerous sightings, a craft appeared in the sky, a beam came down, and the radiation reading between prior to that event and 10 minutes afterwards was remarkably different. And not only is that interesting in terms of people go, oh, great, that means they're benevolent space aliens who just happen to show up in time and do this nice deed. On the other hand, again, think about Mike Masters and the extraterrestrial model. You might have these future humans, these neo-humans, as I call them, scrambling to undo the damage we're doing one step at a time. We think about, apparently the same thing happened at Chernobyl as well, too. There were sightings of craft, and perhaps that was mitigated to some degree, especially when you pair that with the frequent messages about the danger of nuclear weapons and the dangers of our technological progress in light of our lack of consciousness progress. And again, what the kids in Zimbabwe were told. So all of this is really, really fascinating. And how it's being told from a Hollywood perspective in a credible way, taken seriously, and just thinking about how many more hundreds of thousands of people are being aware of these incidents because of this.
Yeah, and I think that really gets to part of where we want to go here, and that's are these tracks moving at the right speed together? Are we because it is a multifaceted sort of unfolding, and it has to unfold in a way that is most beneficial for our world. And so you can't, in some respects, let the horse get, or the cart get too far ahead of the horse, right? We have to think about, well, where is the public consciousness? How are we thinking about this in our public conversation, in our discourse? Are we more open to this? Is it being discussed on legacy media? Is it not? What's the chuckle factor? Where are we there? And then you have to think about that in parallel with, where is it moving legislatively? Where is it moving with the people who have the ability to unearth the secrets? And I think this is the place that we actually are in at the moment. It's are these tracks moving together in the right way, or is one getting too far ahead of the other? And if one does, is there an ability to course correct that? What kind of players are involved to make sure that this unfolds in a way that would be most beneficial? And I know you've talked about that to some degree, and Danny, of course, talked a lot about where we are with the legislation. Seemed very certain of where this is going in 2024, almost like there's a roadmap already in place. Are we on the right trajectory at the moment, or do we still need to wait a little bit longer for the world at large to kind of be ready to hear this?
Well, several really interesting questions there that come out of the same sort of root development here. Let's first discuss what Danny and Steve were discussing. And basically they were suggesting, Steve seemed particularly assured, almost like he was resting on his laurels a little bit, saying, it might look like there's a pushback happening. And sure, there are some people associated with the military-industrial complex who work in congressional districts where they're housing these aerospace contractors. And of course, they're going to push back because that's what they want them to say. But the damage has already been done, in the sense that, again, I think people need to be aware that there have been anywhere from 24 to 40 or so whistleblowers that have come forward. So people have been saying, again, on the front lines in ufology, saying, who's the next David Grush? But we have to remember, he's just the one that had a unique situation because he had secondhand knowledge where he could actually say some things publicly. There have been many, including that quote I read from Schellenberger's article earlier, firsthand and secondhand witnesses have come forward. So those people who have touched the craft, worked on the craft, seen the bodies apparently, right? Things like that. That's the implication there, that those people have also testified. So we're well beyond this concern about, well, it's just hearsay, Bill Nelson's kind of thing. One friend said this, another friend said that. Right. So that's happened. And basically what both Steve and Danny were saying was that this was an interesting take. And as you and I were talking about before we went on the air, sometimes it's good to get outside of your, initial sort of circles so that you can see what other people, even legacy ufology people, are saying about this, because it's a bit of a different crowd. And they were saying basically that if you read the Schumer legislation, it really looks like legislation for a post-disclosure world, is what they actually said. That this is basically putting in place the infrastructure, knowing that this is going to happen, and then you have some next steps ready to go. And that's basically what I've hinted at with you as well. I've said in the past that they're not insinuating that there may have been a cover-up. They're saying there was, and this is how it was conducted. They're saying not that there may perhaps, by some stretch of the imagination, be something that's not quite human. No, they're saying non-human intelligence like 21 times or something. So this is remarkable. I mean, the actual name of the document is like the disclosure plan or something, right? I mean,
Right.
campaign. It's just remarkable how they've almost gone to people like Danny Sheehan, apparently, who's been one of the people that have helped craft this language. And again, remembering that he has a background, a legislative background, being an attorney working some really major cases historically, but he also has his background with ufology and the Disclosure Project, that they're taking these terms right out of the Disclosure Project of the 90s and dropping them into this legislation, word for word. It's remarkable. It certainly looks like they're saying, not only let's prepare for this, but let's use language so we're not even being vague about it. We're just coming out and saying, yes, the things you've been talking about, they're real. Let's use those terms. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's use terms like non-human intelligence instead of ET or aliens so that we leave open the possibility that this might be much more complex. Hint, hint, it is. And that allows us the wiggle room to work with that. It certainly doesn't seem like the kind of legislation that's meant to just buy another 10 years. It seems like legislation that's putting in place some architecture, at least some scaffolding for the next stage. And they seem to really believe, I'd like to get your take about what your sense was of what they were saying, but you certainly had the sense from them that there was this confidence that basically all the ducks are in a row. Some things need to happen. Some things need to get negotiated. There's 300 days for the aerospace companies and whatnot to respond with any materials they have. We had this discussion about eminent domain. They're ready to go in and take whatever craft they have, take whatever intellectual material they have for the sake of, quote unquote, the American people, which is a constitutional statement, basically, they're relying on there with eminent domain. And because of that, there's some wiggle room about how long the panel will take, how long the defense contractors will take within that 300 days. Then there's some wiggle room about you negotiate this, you negotiate that. But they certainly seem to think, basically, that either 2024 or early 2025, and the whole shebang is done.
Yeah, case closed. I mean, I have a hard time sharing the same sort of optimism that they exude, although I think it's very exciting. And we talked a little bit about this before we went on the air tonight, that there are these kind of factions in ufology, and they've got a lot of connections. These guys have been in that field for a very long time, and they've got a lot of connections, and maybe they have legitimate reason to be that optimistic. I think the language, as you pointed out, is absolutely a signpost here that says that there is a legitimate reason to be optimistic. How often is it the case where Congress drafts legislation proactively? Most of the time it's a reactive situation. And here we have a very proactive, very comprehensive scaffolding put in place that, before things have actually happened. And that tells me, again, I'm putting pieces together. That tells me that some real thought has gone into this, that nobody wants to be in the position when that other shoe drops and there's no governmental framework to actually deal with this. That would be the worst possible position to be in. A huge shoe drops, and you're telling me we've got no panel of experts. We've got no mechanism by which to examine this information. We've got no mechanism by which to declassify this information. We've not even thought about this, and you guys have been sitting on this for decades. You tell me we have nothing, and that would be a tremendous disaster for everyone, and keep in mind, namely the executive branch. They're going to be the ones, holding the bill there if they don't have a plan. And so, what do we see? We see something from the same party as the executive putting this legislation forward, and it's very comprehensive. So, again, putting the pieces together here, I could see there being reason for optimism. My concern is, are we ready? Are we ready as society for getting these kinds of secrets? And then a great point that was raised by Danny Sheehan, if Congress gets this information, keep in mind, Congress, they're people just like you and me. I mean, I get it. Once they've been there a while, they make a lot of money and they're not like you and me, but they're supposed to be there representing all of us. So when they get this information, what are they going to do with it? Are they going to make it public? How will they make it public? Who gets to know all the details? How much do we actually know? And then I'm always concerned about what are the ethical reasons and the ethical framework that we should be thinking about for what should be and shouldn't be made public? What's our responsibility with that information?
Again, great questions and consequential questions that really deserve a show unto themselves. There's a few things I want to say. Let's bookmark a few of those questions so we can get them, because each one I think is essential. So remember the questions you just posed there and remind me of them in a minute. But before we get there, I just want to quickly discuss some of the things that, again, Steve and Danny referenced in that conference in terms of what is going to be involved in this disclosure. Because when you ask the question about, are we ready? How much will actually be made public? Those are great questions. And I think to get there, we should talk about what is involved here. What really is the nature of these revelations? And one of the pieces that they hinted at was that the Manhattan Project, nuclear development, 1947, right? I could add things like the development of the CIA and the intelligence state, right? All of this happened right at the same time. And they seem to really imply that the Manhattan Project, nuclear warfare, Roswell, it's all somehow tied up together, right? And they also talked about, and this is something I've been aware of that I've not spoken too much about, but they basically spoke about, and again, this speaks to the nature of these accords, that this is exactly the information that I've heard elsewhere, is that some of these flaps are not just about UFOs who happen to have their own agenda and just happen to be flying by that day. Those were sometimes intimidation responses to the U.S. government or elements of it that were not adhering to some of the accords the way that this non-human intelligence or neo-human intelligence was comfortable with. So they said, you're not going to do what we asked? We're going to fly over the White House, 1952, in a huge flap. This was discussed, right? So I can talk about it. And no one's thinking about those kinds of things. You're saying there's intimidation involved in this kind of like manipulation back and forth. And if you don't do what we said, you really want everybody to know, here we are flying over the White House. It's almost like a cliche, like the landing on the White House lawn. How about we get the next best thing? We fly over the White House. This is what's been involved historically. So to answer your question, or at least to introduce the question, begin to work with it, but are we ready? Just that alone, the notion that perhaps even we've talked before about this notion of gifting fields as opposed to crash retrievals. We talk about things like Einstein and Oppenheimer being aware of the crash retrieval program, perhaps even being given tips, material tips that tip the scales of World War II. You think people are ready for that? That their complete understanding of 20th century history, how the war was waged and how some sort of group, perhaps from the future, wanting the timeline to go a certain way rather than another. Again, like I said before, I think I said this on our interview with James Iandoli, this is like Philip K. Dick kind of territory, like alternate realities, and that there's interventions happening to favor one over another. So this is what's involved here. And as I sort of hinted at with you before I went on the air, I'm aware even of certain strategies that are being used right now that can lean the timeline one way or another, that it's happening as we speak right now. So this is what's involved. And this is just the beginning of what's involved. But are people ready for the revelation, not just of non-human intelligence, but perhaps the notion of time travel, and that cause and effect and linear progression is not how things really work? And the fact that the entire history of 20th century was partly about the intervention of either extraterrestrials that just happen to know a lot or care a lot, or future humans trying to change a timeline. The founding of the CIA and the deep state, the security state, all being tied to this gray secret. These are revelations. Is that the kind of thing you discuss over dinner one night? It just is. It's a lot to really take in, for sure.
Yeah. Well, and then getting to, some of the questions that I raised there, who gets brought into those conversations and when? I think this is something that really came out of the hearing and at the end of July in the House. You have these House members who aren't necessarily particularly high ranking or have these incredible clearances or whatever, but they're being brave. They forced this hearing to take place. You got these incredible witnesses, And, are these the folks that should be getting the information that they're asking for, And then what do we see happen? We see a heavy hand step in and say, yeah, we're not going to let you we're not going to let you listen to that. We're not going to let you, hear that from David Grush right now. We're going to make up a reason why. So you can tell that this information is being controlled. It's being controlled, and who gets to hear it and when, and who has already heard it. So I think it's purposeful. And, one of the questions that spins out of that is, what would be, and Danny asked this again, what would be reasons for why that information is so tightly controlled? And you certainly touch on many of those, that if it gets in the wrong hands, if the wrong people hear it, and then they're instantly going onto their X account and posting about it to all of their millions of followers, is that the way we want this information to be released to the public and the world? Is that the way that this should go? How should it go? What's the right way that it should unfold? Because to keep in mind, we have, even though a lot of our institutions are kind of crumbling right now, we still very much have a framework in our society whereby knowledge becomes acknowledged, formally adopted and digested by the worldwide collective mind. And if it doesn't go through that process, even when it does, quite frankly, you and I, we talked about this, even when it does go through the normal chain of dissemination, we live in a time where people don't take that very seriously, or they insert a lot of questions. So we have that challenge at work as well. How does this get presented? What's the right format? Who are the right people? What's the level of collaboration? Is it international? Should it be international? All of these things are at play here. It's not just a matter of the president stepping up behind a podium and making a statement. I mean, the level of coordination about releasing this into the world has to be, I think, at the highest level.
Yeah, and as we've discussed before, and I've talked about on Point of Convergence, unfortunately, the people that will be given this information, if it does get uncovered from the deep state and from the aerospace companies and whatnot, the military-industrial complex, and makes its way up even into congressional hands, are those the best quality people, the most evolved leaders that are prepared to make those decisions for the rest of humanity? When, as you kind of hinted at, when they are finally made aware of the depth, or at least some of the depth and breadth of this matter, will they say, hold on, sorry, when I signed up for this and public disclosure, I didn't know what was involved. Now my perspective is very different. And Danny raised this, again, with his legislative background, and I've had other people mention it to me as well. When they read this Schumer legislation, the one thing they are worried about is it sure looks like Congress is going to get their hands on the information. There is no guarantee that the public will. They are still going to make decisions then. There's still some wiggle room on what gets classified as a national security issue and therefore not divulged. And again, people who are sort of looking past that, I think, are assuming that, well, yeah, it's not going to be anything that's going to be specifically national security oriented, so we don't really have to worry about that. But again, that makes assumptions about what the nature of these revelations are. What do you do, for instance? I'm just going to introduce this as a notion. If you find out that there's been accords with various military groups in exchange for technology that included the agreements about abduction of citizens, and to divulge that to the public would so undermine faith in government and even in the military services that are such a part of the fabric of American society even today. Is that really something people are prepared to offer up as a potentially incredibly destabilizing element in a society, as we keep saying, that already feels like it's on the cusp of civil war every other day? So this is a lot to think about. And I think really this is much darker in some ways than some people are prepared for. And again, I really want to make this point. I made a tweet today, something to the effect of, on the one hand, if someone says to you that there are some non-human intelligence who do not really have humanity's best interest in mind, and you have somebody else who says to you, I believe there's non-human intelligence who are here to help us evolve our consciousness, both can be true. Indeed, both are true. And so this is part of the complexity here. But that said, I would say to people that sometimes the ones that are the most visible, the most active, the most interventionary, the most likely to sign accords with military groups are not those ones necessarily interested in the evolution of human consciousness. So think about what's actually been disclosed, which ones are being brought to the surface in the midst of that, considering how already destabilized our current American society is.
Yeah, it's complex to say the least. I mean, it's sort of like a science experiment where you're kind of trying to mix some chemicals together and not blow up the lab in the process, right? And who does it benefit, in fact, if the lab has an explosion? I think we have to consider that disclosure or elements of disclosure may not be positive. And I don't mean in the sense that, not knowing the truth. You're saying not knowing the truth is not a positive thing. It'd be better to know the truth. Well, no, it is better to know more about reality. But I'm talking in terms of what we would do behaviorally, what human beings will do behaviorally. And as you've talked about many times, and folks I think are aware, there are many different levels of conscious development in the world. Even in the United States, we've got folks that are at different levels of development and awareness, different spheres of concern. Some people who really just care about themselves, others who care about their communities or who are cognizant of their country or who are cognizant of the entire world and how their actions do, in fact, impact, the rest of the planet, right? So we have all of these different personalities, if you will, at work, and it could be very dangerous to just sort of dump all this on that mix. It could be a powder keg. And then what do we do? And you can imagine if you're in a position where you have a very high view of this, 30,000 foot view of the situation, and you've been intimately involved with aspects of the control and the agreements, et cetera, you have a much better sense of who's ready, when we're ready, et cetera. And then you talk to experiencers. And I've talked to some recently, and their feeling is that there's been a lot of effort to kind of get the population ready so that there are people, whether through hybridization or just through encounter, are primed to deal with whatever this may be. And maybe we're entering into a time where not only is our conscious development maturing in some ways, we're able to mature. There's an invitation for maturity, but we also have a mixture of people in the world that are ready and willing to accept this greater truth and what that means. And it's just the next stage. It's not like it's a done deal, everybody. I mean, it's not like we're gonna sort of write an essay about what disclosure is, and then we're just gonna the book closes and now we have disclosure, everyone. Like, it's not like that. And we've always said that. So I think we have to be ready for this prolonged and challenging and maybe increasingly shocking sort of series of revelations that we'll have.
When you just think about human history, even recent human history, and how humans tend to handle certain kinds of outcomes, it speaks tellingly about the state of consciousness in the world. A couple examples come to mind. I was in Vancouver in 2011, which was the year that the Vancouver Canucks were playing the Boston Bruins for the Stanley Cup. Now, it turns out that the Canucks lost in seventh game. So being mature human beings, you would assume they would hang their heads and say, well, better luck next time to us. We got really far. Let's acknowledge the improvement in the team, and next year we'll get it. No, instead they did is they tore up the city. They tore up their own city, right? Something very similar happened just a few weeks ago in a soccer stadium in Europe. In their own soccer stadium, not in the visiting soccer stadium. We think in the middle of COVID and people did runs on toilet paper. This is what happens when people feel destabilized. When their identity is so tied to certain outcomes and certain perspectives, right? And this is something Lou Elizondo hinted at with humankinds, trying to introduce, again, not specific revelations, which I think a lot of people kind of latched onto, but more just think outside the box, expand your assumptions about your place in the universe. and that being a necessary preparatory step for whatever is coming. But when people are so sure that this will be a good thing and that we'll be better off than we are now because, gosh darn it, we're not in a good place now. No, we're not. But again, it's in this state of things that things like a sports team losing causes people to rip up their own city and engage in mob behavior. And I literally saw people the next day in shock at their own behavior. They were literally caught up, and speaking of this coherent field, in a mob energy, and they did things they can't understand because their energy was dominated and overcome by this incredibly strong negative collective field, all about unrealized potential, about a sports team. Okay, and the same thing happened in Europe just a couple of weeks ago. So again, this speaks to how fragile we are, like we're just barely hanging on. And knowing how complex this is, like you said, it's not like you can just rubber stamp and say, good, we finally got that out. Because whatever you get out, it just prompts 100 more questions. And their questions, as I've said recently, again, on social media, goes to the foundation of who we are and the foundation of what reality is. I think, yes, these are questions we eventually need to get to, but it's a really serious question we have to give some real gravity to in terms of thinking this through, because what we're pointing to here is that sometimes, as much as things are not great, the wrong kind of information at the wrong time can be the very thing that sets things in a much worse trajectory than they were before. And again, I just want to introduce this notion to people. I said before that some of the ones that are the most visible, the most interventionary, are the ones that maybe are acting from service to self kind of perspective, introducing some raw contact material kind of terminology there. On the flip side, those who tend to hang back more, who tend to work on the long game of trying to help evolve human consciousness, those ones, I would suggest to people, are anti-disclosure. Not because they like to pull the wool over humans' eyes, because they want to dominate us or keep us like a zoo, but quite the contrary, because they have the big picture in mind. And from their perspective, we are not ready. And that speaks to them saying that with an understanding of what actually is on the table, right? So a lot of people are making these assumptions without really knowing what the ball game is, how deep it goes. And I'm saying with those who do have an understanding of what's involved, with that 30,000 foot view you said, they're saying we look at the lay of the land right now, the way the ant colony is right now, and we say this would not be the right move for their best interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that gets to questions that I wanted to tackle on this show. What has been hurt by this legacy of secrecy? And you can easily think about when the secrets began, when the secret keeping began, those institutions were created, like you mentioned, the CIA and the intelligence apparatus. And, we started telling ourselves the public's not ready. They're not ready for this. We should study this. This could be powerful. We want to have the upper hand over our adversaries. Let's squirrel this away. Let's, create this incredible apparatus to hide this from our adversaries. Okay, you could see why that decision was made. But let's think about for a second, you did talk about Philip K. Dick's, let's think about alternate history. What would have happened if instead of taking that path, the worldwide community were engaged on this and we're saying, hey, we discovered this. We don't know much about it. We're now going to try to understand this. We're going to create an international panel of scientists and experts to try to study this. We're going to publish our findings. We're going to disseminate this information. This could be revolutionary in terms of energy production. We don't even know. We're going to share what we learn as we go. Where would we be now? Because in some ways, yes, it would have been incredibly shocking. And yes, it would have been destabilizing to the world where it was at that time. Many people were very religious. They're not quite as religious now. Maybe they would have had a difficult time dealing with that. But in some ways, it's sort of like that would be better than where we are now, because you've got all of these skeletons in the closet. The closet, you can't even keep it closed anymore. Literally, it's about to burst and this stuff's going to fly into the room and it's going to bury us in the process, right? That's really where we are. And I think that's the danger of what has happened by telling lie after lie after lie. It's creating this tsunami of truth that we're just not really ready to deal with. And I kind of, in a way, I weep for the fact that our science has been held back, our metaphysics has been held back, the things that we could do with the energy and our understanding of who we are, what our history is, our place in the larger universe, all of these things could be at an entirely different place right now over the span of the last few decades if we had just made some different decisions. And we didn't. So how do we course correct? And can we do that in an appropriate way? And what's the ethical framework? If we were to ask a reasonable person, we run into this, you and I see it every week, people that are in social media that are just basically lighting the torches to try to get this information out tomorrow. If we were to really sit them down and say, okay, well, tell me what would be ethical reasons why you wouldn't let this be known, or why you would, how is the best way to proceed with this? Do we really think that most everybody would be like, nah, man, I'm just let her rip, we can handle it? I just think that is a very naive, short-sighted, immature perspective to hold. And, we both have kids, right? We know that you don't just tell them everything about the world in one go. You try to introduce them to that information slowly over time. We didn't do that with this topic. We should have, but now we have an opportunity to try to let that unfold. And can we do that responsibly? That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, before we went on the air, I made the joke that imagine if a 5-year-old comes to you and says, I want transparency. Tell me the full deal.
Right.
I want adult life understanding right now. We would not give them that because we would recognize that it would not be in their best interest. And yes, I think what you're pointing to here is that there's this kind of naive perspective that the grass is always greener on the other side, that people look at what a mess the world is, and it is a mess, and they assume surely it can't be any worse with disclosure. And surely disclosure could potentially solve many of the challenges we're currently facing that seem to be overwhelming us. Those are all potentially true things, but the challenge is you have to take the time to do the research, understand what's really in play, and then determine whether or not that's really the case, though. Is it the case that the information we have will only be used to solve the problems and not create 10 more? And while it's doing that, creating up the 10 more, they're that much more catastrophic. If you have 0-point energy that can collapse space-time, as I said in a recent podcast, is that really something you want to introduce? These are real questions. And I think, too, what's interesting about the whole thing about the series of lies, so you said now there's kind of the tsunami of lies waiting to come on shore. What's interesting, and again, Danny Sheehan spoke to this, that around the time that this huge secret was decided to be kept, there's very different sort of circumstantial things going on at the time. Number one, wartime, busy trying to deal with global issues, right? You also have this sense that there actually was a really high degree of trust in government. America and the Allies won the war. The evil Nazis have been defeated. Never before have Americans been so proud of their country, and allied countries as well. And so there was a lot of sense that we can use some of this credibility to write a blank check to some degree, and we'll deal with this later. With the assumption again there, implicit in that we will still have that traction with the American public, that they will listen to us on the evening news, and Walter Cronkite will share some information we give, and the people will say, well, that's so nice that they're telling us now, and they did the right thing and waiting till now. Instead, what we have, like you say, is this massive building chock full of secrets that speak to the actual 20th century history. It's just waiting, like you said, like the closet that's so chock full, the second you open the door, the whole thing collapses. There's so much to come out. At the very time where there's the least amount of trust in American government ever, not even anything like consistent understanding, cohesive understanding about what government should be, what American society should look like. We are going through massive demographic shifts that are putting pressure on the populace. And like you hinted at earlier, we've got like 3 different main worldviews that are all going to interpret this information differently. And that's just within our country alone. So it's really a remarkable situation, which again, like you say about the legacy of the lies and keeping this secret, one of them speaks to the fact that you should never assume that you will know what the future will be like and assume that by putting it off, that'll be the right move. Because again, now would be in some ways the worst time ever to let it out, you could argue. But at the same time, as you and I spoke about before we went on the air, There are so many things going on right now at the same time. The rise of AI, robotics, the just shifting political perspectives in the country where we really are closer to civil war than ever in some ways. People literally talking about we should really split up the states at this point because there's such a different view of the fundamental nature of reality and what is considered valuable and defendable even. So these are all happening at the same time. I would also argue that this is part of the reason why it is happening now. It must be part of the reason why it's happening now. Again, this comes back to a question we've entertained before. When we think about what Danny Sheehan and Steve Bassett said about how everything seems to be in place, so this is going to happen. They have a very hard time believing this will be reversed at this point. And that's where I really do lean on, especially Danny's incredible legislative history. So if that's the case, why now? Again, we've said this before. Is it because the powder keg brewing around us is so potent that we need some sort of injection of something into the system to alleviate some sort of tension that is building to a powder keg, like you said? And or is it the case that some of these non-human intelligences that we are in communication with have also said, now is the time because something is about to happen if you don't do this, in terms of, again, intervening, changing timelines. And again, then you have to ask yourself, when we talk about there being a spectrum of benevolent ones that are trying to evolve human consciousness rather than solve immediate problems, more interested in the overall evolution of consciousness. And as I've been saying in our class and saying on podcasts, it being more about a stage set for the evolution of consciousness than being primarily concerned with what happens here and now, then who really are the ones arguing for disclosure now on the other side I'm talking about, with the others? Which of those, that spectrum of otherness, are the ones that are saying this should happen now? I really want to have people think about that a lot, because again, if what happens is the opposite of what people think is going to happen, if there's a chance that this actually might sow more division because you have these competing worldviews that are going to interpret this very differently, and this might potentially push the world into even more turmoil, what groups would want that and why? These are questions worth asking, and that's why I think it's callous and irresponsible to have either a Pollyanna view or this darkness and demons view and assume it's black or white, binary like that. I think we have to think about populating profusely almost the possibility of many different kinds of others along a spectrum, and then really think about what would be the possible motivations here. We shouldn't assume they're all bad or all good. We have to think about that as well as what's going on in the world right now to have some sense of what would be the responsible decision. Because that's what I hear behind what you're saying, is what's the responsible decision? And rather than looking at your government like mom and dad and just give us the information, would you? We want to know what our Christmas presents are. Instead, if you were the person that had to first review the material and then decide, is this in the world's best interest? That's, I think, a lot of gravity to have to deal with. And this is what Congress, to some degree, is going to have to deal with. And so even when we ask this question, will they release to the public? Again, I don't think we should assume, although I know in ufology it's a very popular stance to take, that if they don't, then gosh darn it, it's those government people again hiding the information. They may decide, even though they are not the greatest leaders in the world, not the most evolved people, but even they, in their limited understanding, their limited development of consciousness, might recognize that this might actually put us in a worse place than if we didn't know. These are things to at least think about. I'm not saying this is the case, but we have to be very careful to not jump to these knee-jerk reactions of it's going to be all good or it's all bad.
Yeah. And, we've talked before, and many people have mentioned this, that it's modeled after the JFK, sort of paradigm there. And if you think about that, in a way, that could be a good signpost for what we might expect. What they did with the JFK panel, keeping the things, sort of behind classification for a very long period of time, is they essentially created the conspiracy that there was some truth to some shady dealings with the U.S. government and what happened, and some culpability with Kennedy's assassination. So that became pretty much the governing perception, even though the public didn't have all of the facts. right? But what that allows the public to do is almost like it's like a slow digestion. It's sort of like, yeah, okay, well, we've read it and we've got a lot of stuff. We're keeping it under a classification. It's going to get declassified, we promise, but it's going to take another 10 years, 20 years, then we're going to release more documents. By doing that and taking that approach, they're essentially trying to place a governor on the release of this information to in hopes that the soil might be fertile for receiving this truth at that point in time, because you're kind of letting it germinate. You're basically winking at everybody and saying, yeah, I mean, this is real, but we're not going to tell you all the details. So we're just going to let the public kind of sit on this, think about this, and it's real, and then we'll slowly release more and more detail as maybe the time is right. Now, I think the frustration, and understandably so, is that, who are you to tell me when the time is right? I've had an experience. I need to know that this is true. Who are you to hold this from me? And I think that's, look, it's a legitimate complaint. But you have to put yourself in their shoes. Here you are in a position that can influence millions of people, billions of people, quite frankly, because it's an interconnected world. What would you do? What would be the responsible thing to do there? So I think that's really the decision calculus at play here. I wonder whether or not it will be able to be contained, because there are so many players involved. There are so many folks who come forward. How well can this be kept secret? I obviously want it to be divulged. I think we all would love to see the secrets come out. But I also have kids. I live in a neighborhood. I live in a city. I live in a connected world. I want to see that world continue to thrive in a healthy way. And would it do so if we were just to kind of dump all of this on our laps? We've got some real challenges ahead of us. And the last thing I want to say before I turn it back to you is about paradigm shifts. And we often in the modern day, we think about paradigm shifts from the standpoint of technology. What's the next iPhone? What's the next Mid-Journey or whatever it is going to wow us and change how we do everything? When is that going to happen? It's all from a technological lens. Our hope is placed in this technology as our salvation, as our future. But the paradigm shift that you and I are talking about is actually not technological at all. It's an evolution, a revolution of consciousness, of awareness. And that's the paradigm shift that will take place. And the problem with that is we haven't had a shift like that in a very long time, right? The world has not ever, at least in the degree that it's connected right now, has not had a shift in its conscious framework at this level, at this scale, at this scope ever. And that's what's going to take place. That's what needs to take place, rather, in order for this to be, I think, received in a healthy way and for us to move forward into the next iteration of what it means to be humans on this earth. So I don't know what you think about that, but that comes to mind for me, really kind of thinking about what we're going to have to exchange and give up if we really want to move this forward. We're going to have to give up some of our ideas in wanting it to be a technological savior and exchange that for maybe real work that I've got to do on myself.
Yeah, and another way to think about it is that if your choice is more technological progress, you might be just delaying the processes that most necessarily need to come about, right? If, as I've said many times, I really think you can reduce all of our problems, both personally and collectively, to problems in consciousness, basically. And that if we really just had new technology, that alone will not be sufficient. This is why I founded Essence of Being, because my clear understanding, even some communication I've had around this, involves this understanding that a new model, while absolutely necessary, we need to get beyond fossil fuels and a carbon-based economy, and even beyond brute force capitalism and that kind of skeptical, cynical view of this is the best we can do. It was the best at one point. We can look back and acknowledge that it was a system that was better than what else was available at the time. And it got us where we are. We can be thankful for it. We can honestly acknowledge many, many of the amazing marvels and ways that lifespans and whatnot were increased. Health around the world was increased, some places more than others, but that largely being the benefit of the modern world. This comes down to what I spoke about in our class yesterday about transcending including, looking back at the marvels of the modern world. There are many, many great things. Some people want to look back and say, really, we're not better off. We should just go back to being farmers again, living off the land. We'd be better off. That's a bit naive. There are many, many amazing things that happened. But at the same time, without a requisite growth in consciousness, those things also begin to seed the next levels of demise as well. And that's happened as well. So now we're at the point where it's not really a lack of technology. I would suggest to people that is the problem. So if you're looking that to be your savior, you're actually misapprehending what the issue really is. So this is something to really be aware of. And I think this is, again, as I said a few minutes ago, what the most ascendant ones are thinking about. This is the perspective they have. But I just want to bring a couple things to people's mind as well here around this legislation and what we talked about earlier, just in terms of really helping people to understand how much language has been taken full stock out of ufology and dropped into this legislation. The name here is actually the Controlled Disclosure Campaign Plan. That is just remarkable. Every time I look at that, I can't believe it. Number one, there's the word controlled. Grant Cameron has a book called Managing Magic, which is along a similar lines. This notion that there has been this understanding, and so over time, according to his view anyway, there's been at the executive branch this understanding, and that people like Tom DeLonge have been part of a long process to slowly acclimatize the public, like you said. So that's the managing magic part. Controlled, in this case, is the word that's used. Disclosure campaign plan. I don't know how much more you can be more specific. And there's even already, and this is what they were talking about with Steve Bassett and Danny Sheehan, there's already the infrastructure being put in place to begin to traverse us to the post-disclosure world. And this goes to that 9-person panel. Basically, this is about taking people from different fields that have relevant things to say about this and how it will transform our society, pulling them together, or at least first putting together a list. I think Danny Sheehan was one of the people that have been suggesting some people on the list. That goes to the president. The president chooses from that list 9 people. He can also appoint some of his own. This is literally happening. This is not Independence Day, the movie. This is literally happening. President Biden will pick 9 people to become part of this panel to talk about these issues and how we're going to acclimatize our civilization with these kind of revelations. This is really remarkable. This is happening as we speak. These aerospace companies have 300 days to respond. There's this language really strongly put together around eminent domain. If you don't give it to us, we will take these crash retrievals. We will take these materials that you've developed. We will take these biologics that are being stored in freezers and whatnot. And then it becomes a changed world. This is what's in play here. What I think is really interesting about this is so many of us have been caught up with the chase, with waiting, oh, just one day we'll get there, that there's that kind of rat race, right? Not really thinking about what if you get what you want, then what? Well, based on what these 2 guys with quite a bit of experience and understanding and history in this field are saying, this is about to happen. So now we need to ask those next level of questions. What will this produce in our society? Are we sure it's the best thing? How will we look on the other side of this? These are questions we should ask at this next stage.
Yeah, that's a huge task to kind of pick those people. And, when you think about that list of 9, and of course, as you said, the president can add additional appointees. It's not like these 9 people are really making all the decisions by themselves. They're going to have support. They're going to want people to consult with in their own disciplines. That's what we would want. But you could also see how that's not just going to be isolated to the United States, right? We know for a fact other governments, you talked about at the top of the show, have been dealing with this for a long time as well. So will they follow in a similar suit? Will they assemble groups of people who will deal with aspects and how this information will impact their societies? Because, we have to be real. Like the West has a certain way of looking at the world, at the present, at history, at our culture than the East does. And we would want people who know how those societies think and function to be involved in that process and to work through ways in which they can share that information with them in a responsible way. So will all these efforts be taking place? Will they work with each other? I mean, what a world that we would live in where this could be happening. And on top of that, in the sort of everyday mix, we're going to have people that we have to treat more seriously. People who have been telling us for years, I've had experiences. This happened to me. I wasn't lying. Now I wasn't lying. I mean, how is our society going to wrestle with that while this 9-member panel or whatever, as I just mentioned, kind of comes to their final conclusions, right? Because all of these things are going to have to happen in parallel. And maybe it'll be amazing. And maybe this kind of collective effort will present an opportunity for us to rise to that challenge and allow us to band together in ways that we've not before. But in order to do that, we're really going to have to put aside a lot of our differences. We're going to have to put aside some of our squabbles and focus on this very serious task. Can we do that? I can't think of a worldwide situation where we've been able to do that in decades, at least. So I'm a little bit worried about it, just to be frank.
It is mind-boggling to think about. And I think something else I want to introduce here, as we sort of come to the close of the show, is again how context is king, as they say. And it's easy for us even here to become too focused on the human equation. And not even just the human equation, but the 21st century human equation, or the Western civilization human equation, or even the American concerns. So it's been interesting. I've been reading Michael Masters' latest book, Revelation, The Future Human Past, which, by the way, I have a copy here that he gave to both of us, Nathan, and he actually signed it inside, made a nice little note to both of us. I'm going to pass it on to you when I'm done.
Awesome.
But what's interesting about this satirical time travel novel is that it's very satirical, but the points being made are meant to be really wrestled with. And one of the interesting points in this is that perhaps you will have not just one perspective on what the right solution is or the right outcome, but actually when you, again, using your analogy of the 30,000 foot view, when you really pull back and see more of the terrain, what if you realize there's two different ways of looking at this event and both are equally good in some way, or that there's not this binary view again about whether this is good or bad? I bring this up because when we discussed earlier this thing about why is this happening now? Why are our politicians pushing this? Why are potentially NHIs or NCHIs involved in saying now is the time for this to happen? Is it because there's knowledge that something's coming? Now I'm going to bring us back to this thing I discussed last year about some coming cataclysm. And one of the possibilities of that cataclysm, of course, is that it's self-induced. It's a nuclear war event of some kind. You and I have discussed before the Ukraine situation, how Putin is ever more like a trapped animal, ready to do whatever it needs to get out of its situation, perhaps towards the end of his life, clearly, and might just decide for the sake of his, again, based on his worldview, the way he sees the world, remnant of the Cold War, he might just say, for the sake of the motherland, I'm going to just detonate the nuclear weapons. Can't be worse than it is now. Look what's happened to us. Such a travesty. That's one possibility. That's a very, very real possibility. Amidst all the other things we said that are real challenges to our world right now, there's also the real possibility of nuclear war because of something that happens with Russia, because it's such a destabilized situation. Again, this is what happens, as I've discussed before in the podcast. I discussed it in the class last night as well. When you have technology that makes sense at one point from a certain point of view, but then you have the technology moving forward, you can't uncreate it. And suddenly that one of these really stable, relatively stable superpowers now is a very destabilized country, having a hard time adjusting with the modern world in the 21st century, and a leader who's backed into a corner. So that is not the ideal situation. Again, it comes down to a consciousness problem. Yes, nuclear weapons are a problem, but really primarily it's consciousness-based more than anything else. One thing you and I have not talked about as a scenario, I don't think at all in any of our Liminal Frames episodes, but it's a growing possibility, and that's nuclear war between the U.S. and China. There are many people looking at this situation from a geopolitical perspective, and they see it basically as inevitable. This is the language they're using, that the next great clash of civilizations will be between the Chinese communist model and the American model, and that you can already see ways that land's being bought up around the world to position for this geopolitically and geospatially. So I bring that to your attention because in this really interesting book by Mike Masters, there's this notion that what if one future human group is trying to go back into the past and change the timeline, like what we talked about, where things like Fukushima, things like Chernobyl, things like the scales being tipped in World War II, right? These kind of things. That's the best outcome from a certain point of view for a certain group of people, right? But what's interesting with this book is that what happens is just when they're about to prevent a nuclear war, which supposedly is the cataclysm in this book, that's what it is. Sorry if I'm spoiling it, Mike, but this is important stuff. And so basically what happens when they're about to do that, they've done a bunch of other tweaking and they're about to, these are the humans that look like us, right? So they're not too far in the future. They're about to stop this nuclear cataclysm, thinking it's the right thing to do. The last minute, these grays show up, which are much further from the future, and they stop them with their much more superior technology. And the reason is because from their point of view, that would not be a good thing because they are the outcome of that nuclear war. And what's interesting is not that the situation is left like that in the book. One of the things that Mike does, and I think he does it well, is that there's one character that says, what if there's a third option? Is there a way that we can actually mitigate the concerns of both parties? Why are we assuming that a binary answer is the only one possible? So again, this speaks to what we've been talking about tonight, broadening the scope, opening the aperture, as I like to say almost every podcast, so that we really think about the greatest good for the greatest number of parties involved.
It's incredible stuff. And yeah, I talk about mind blown. I mean, there's just a lot to consider there and unpack. And I've mentioned before that from my perspective, and I've really grown in looking at it from this perspective. Much of what we see in ufology is a very human imprint, a very human attempt at fixing things and tinkering with things and trying to right our mistakes, and in that not being very successful. So that doesn't surprise me. To me, it fits the data pretty well. But as we've said too, we're not the only players, right? We like to think that we are. And the future human hypothesis, I think, is very compelling. But as you know, we're not the only ones in the game. And so there are other layers here at work that have an even higher view of what's taking place. And they probably are looking out for our best interests collectively, not just, present humans, not future humans, but the whole enterprise, because it is all ultimately one thing, and the development of the entire thing. So what does that group do? How involved are they now? Are they taking a light hand, just sort of letting things proceed because we need to learn our lessons one way or the other? Or are they taking a more active role in what's about to unfold? I think it's a mixed bag. It's going to be very interesting, and hopefully the best thing comes out of it all.
It's interesting you raise that point, because something else that Danny Sheehan said, and again, this speaks to this notion of trying to change the perspective based on changing the party that's looking into the situation, that Danny Sheehan introduced this idea that for some of the cosmic community, the real gem is not humanity, it's the Earth. For the cosmic community, while there are other Earth-like planets, the Earth is a unique gem, the blue marble that was noticed from space when we first went into space. And so much so, in fact, that yes, we are valued as conscious agents, but there's also the sense that the Earth is a conscious agent. We, again, in our modern physicalist perspective, have reduced things, flattened things, so we just think of it as a commodity. So much so that we're using it to the point where we're destroying the very environment that keeps us alive. People are trying to make this point. I see it all the time on social media now. Are we not aware that we are authoring Armageddon with the way that we are handling affairs right now? Again, sort of kicking it down the road, saying eventually we'll get to this, not making it a priority. Again, where's the problem there? Consciousness, not technology. So what's interesting there is this notion that the cosmic community, even the benevolent ones, that are looking for the greatest interest. Again, we shouldn't assume we are at the top of that table. That if it's the case that the earth is the real gem they want to protect, while they would like to protect us, if they have to, they will intervene. This is not what I'm saying. This is what Danny Sheehan has said in this conference about what they were communicating. So again, from what I've heard, there's definitely a sense that part of what caused this intervention, and it's not coincidental, of course, that all of these ones showed up around the dawn of the nuclear era. It's because the planet, not just because of the nuclear weapons, but just because of the weight of the energetic imprint of the low level of consciousness. So a combination of technologically what we're doing to the earth, but even more so, I would argue, just the fact that it absorbs that giant coherent field of human civilization, and that being incredibly oppressive as an experience for the earth, if you can experience the earth as a being. And that, again, this is even part of the information in different channeled material, that the notion then is that the earth gave this distress call to the cosmic community, and the response was to come here to try to mitigate factors. And that even, as I've spoken about in a recent interview, some of the hybrids that have been introduced onto the planet are meant to help become anchors to tune, like antennas, higher consciousness vibration. So that begins to alleviate some of that pressure of the low density that is impacting the earth. But again, with the understanding that if necessary, unfortunately, something you don't like to do, but just like when sometimes an amputation is the only possibility that will save the patient, we really have to ask ourselves, are we the patient? Or are we the thumb or the finger or the elbow of the body, and that we are something that would be considered okay, even though it is a tragedy, to let go for the sake of saving the patient? So again, this is once again about expanding your perspective, realizing we are not the center of the universe, as a civilization, I mean. And once you think about the greatest good for the greatest number of conscious agents involved, then perhaps that changes the perspective. So again, bring it back to disclosure. Think about disclosure in those kinds of terms. How would you think about it differently if you did?
I'm going to give you an amen on that one. So that was fantastic. I agree. I'm not going to add anything to it. That was the best way to end the show. I want to thank our listeners. It's continues to amaze me, the folks that interact with the show and post questions and comments and feedback. We really are blessed with the quality of our audience, and that's a high compliment to us. So thank you all for listening, and we look forward to future episodes. Darren, I don't know how you feel, but I think we've got a lot of work left ahead of us to do. I know there will continue to be new revelations and things worth discussing, but you and I are both invested in this deeper layer that is important to us, and I think important to many people. So that work will continue and may take on new forms. We shall see. And I'm very excited about that. So we'll catch all of you on the next episode. And on that note, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.